This is Vanessa Sullivan. Danny Dawson sits over there, the defendant. The defendant was the designated driver. The defendant was the designated driver that drove drunk. And because the defendant was the designated driver that drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. Vanessa Sullivan was beautiful, intelligent. Had you asked her father about her, he would have told you that Vanessa had grown into a young woman more beautiful and caring than he could have ever have wished for. Had you asked her mother about her, she would have told you how proud she was, because her little girl wanted to become an attorney, just like her mom. September 24th, 2010, was Vanessa's 21st birthday. She planned to go out and celebrate with a few friends. But on September 25th, the car Vanessa was riding in crashed, and she no longer has any plans because she's dead. Now, members of the jury, that day, Vanessa Sullivan invited her best friend and the defendant to go celebrate at a local bar. Now, you're going to hear from Vanessa's best friend. She's going to tell you what Vanessa can. She's going to tell you that on that night, the defendant agreed to be the designated driver. But after agreeing to be the designated driver, the defendant continued to order alcoholic drinks. You're also going to hear from the defendant's server that night. And we believe that server is going to tell you that the defendant ordered drink after drink after drink after drink. We also believe you're going to hear that the defendant was drinking from 2 p.m. that night, that afternoon, all the way until 1 a.m. that morning. The defendant got so drunk that he jumped on stage, grabbed the band's guitar, and wouldn't get off until the bar security had to drag him off stage. Now, throughout that night, the defendant was offered a cab because Vanessa and her best friend thought that he was a little too drunk. You're going to hear how the defendant had chance after chance after chance to have another ride home, not to drive. But the defendant refused all of those options. He got behind the wheel of that car and sped home. Not only did he speed home, but he was swerving uncontrollably. Vanessa was in that car, fearing for her life. The defendant didn't slow down. The defendant lost control of that car and crashed it into a tree and a utility pole, killing Vanessa Sullivan. Now, after that crash, the defendant was taken to the police station to take what's called a blood alcohol concentration test to see just how drunk he was when he was behind the wheel. You're going to hear from the expert that administered that test. That expert is going to tell you that the defendant had a blood alcohol concentration of over twice the legal limit. And that's why we're here today, members of the jury. Because as a prosecution, we've got a burden of proof to you. We have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt just a few things. Now, reasonable doubt is just a doubt for which you've got a common sense reason for. Because we believe you're going to hear that the defendant was driving under the influence of alcohol. Not only that, but the defendant was guilty of negligent homicide because he ignored the risks he was taking after he had all of those drinks and got behind the wheel of the car. We believe you're going to hear that the defendant is guilty of manslaughter because those risks he ignored that night were substantial and unjustifiable. And the defendant is also guilty of murder because when he ignored those substantial and unjustifiable risks, he displayed an extreme indifference to human life. Members of the jury, the reason that Vanessa Sullivan's parents can no longer throw her celebrations, but throw flowers at her grave, the reason her birthday is now the anniversary of her death is because the defendant was the designated driver. The defendant was the designated driver that drove drunk. And because he drove drunk, Vanessa Sullivan is dead. and we believe you will find him guilty of driving under the influence and murder.